Hello, dear students of poetry, and welcome to our 13th lecture. Our 13th lecture is actually a continuation of the 12th lecture about the difference between subjective and objective poetry. What we are going to do today is to read a poem by Coleridge, and we will try to apply what we studied about the difference between subjective and objective poetry. Your homework last time was to decide whether Shakespeare's poem is an objective poem or a subjective poem. After we discuss Coleridge's poem, I am going to discuss whether Shakespeare's poem was subjective or objective, and I will leave another homework related to our poem for today. If you want to start looking at the poem, please go to page 89. Page 89, please. And let us first read the poem as a whole, and then go and start analyzing the poem stanza by stanza. So let me first start by reading the poem. There's a breeze mid blossoms straying, where hope clung feeding like a bee. Both were mine. Life went a maying with nature, hope, and poesy when I was young. When I was young, ah, woeful when, ah, for the change twixt now and then. This breathing house, not built with hands, this body that does me grievous wrong, over airy cliffs and the glittering sands, how lightly then it flashed along, like those trim skiffs unknown of yore, on winding lakes and rivers wide, that ask no aid of sail or oar, that fear no spite of wind or tide, not cared this body for wind or weather, when youth and I lived in it together. Flowers are lovely, love is flower like, friendship is a sheltering tree. Oh, the joys that came down shower like, of friendship, love, and liberty, ere I was old. Ere I was old, ah, woeful air, which tells me youth no longer here. O youth, O youth, for years so many and sweet, it's known that thou when I wear one, I'll think it but a fond conceit. It cannot be that thou art gone. Okay. The poem here, Youth and Age, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is said to be one of his most romantic poems. What does the poet do in this poem? Actually, he presents a contrast between youth and age. And here he is similar to Shakespeare. Through this poem, if you notice, the poet has tried hard, really, to explain how different these two stages of our lives are. And I think we all agree. One of these stages is like a budding flower, and the other one is like dawn. It's really like a dawn in our life. And in order to present these two important stages of life, Coleridge used many beautiful images. Actually, when I read the poem for the first time, the thing which really attracted my attention to the poem and caused me to decide to teach it is the beauty of images in the first place. Okay, now here, if you look at the screen, I have the first stanza of the poem. What does it say? As we read through the first stanza, it comes to our knowledge that the poet attached all the positive things in life with youth, if you notice. And you know, poetry is one harmonious whole. As I always told you, poetry is the fusion of sound and sense. So if the poet is speaking of youth as a beautiful thing, then he used the most powerful imagery of beauty to talk about it. The poet has brought home to all the joys and the liberties that he enjoyed when he was young. Everything appeared to be good, and everything seemed to be achieved easily. The poet was full of aspiring dreams and hopes for the future. And how did the world appear to him? It appeared to be good, and the poet was filled with a new vigor and vitality. And how did the poet achieve this great masterpiece? I think it was because of his great imaginative powers. Um, and that's why Coleridge has succeeded in capturing the joys of youth. Now, please look at line number 1. Notice the poet speaks about verse, a breeze, and he also speaks of hope, and he speaks of poetry. When he was young, he possessed 3 important things: hope, poetry, and nature. Hope, poetry, and nature. I think he did this line 4. He summarized the 3 things: nature, hope, and poesy, which means poetry. Coleridge is trying to say that when you are young, you can enjoy nature and you have more hope because you're still young. And also, your talent reaches its peak during your youth. You are very productive. And another thing that attracted my attention in the first stanza is the beauty of the simile, which starts with line 1. Poetry is likened to a breeze, and the beauty of the simile is brought home by the beauty of the image. You can imagine the visual kinesthetic image used in the line when he describes a verse as a breeze, and this breeze is moving the blossoms of flowers, and hope was likened to a bee that was feeding on the blossoms of the tree. And he said that he possessed all of that. So we notice the use of figurative imagery in the first 3 lines. Figurative imagery, that is a beautiful image plus a figure of speech. So we have a visual kinesthetic image plus a simile. So young people possess everything, and one of the important things is hope, poetry, and nature. Now, Can't the old people enjoy nature? Well, everybody does, but when your powers start to fail you and you start to be weak, I don't think you can enjoy nature the way the young people who are strong and energetic can. So, Coleridge is trying to show the difference. If we move to the second stanza, which starts with when I was young, and it ends with when youth and I lived in it together. In these lines, what do we see? We see the poet remembering very woefully, very sadly, the time gone by. He still remembers the time when he was young, and with a heavy heart, he goes over the changes time had brought in him. And the most important changes which are brought about in his body. So here we find that using his imaginative skills, Coleridge has succeeded in capturing the helplessness and the powerlessness of old age. The poet remembers that in his youth he had all the blessings one could wish for because he was full of vitality and led an active life. And don't you think that those people who were able to have full vitality and to lead an active life are the ones who suffer more when they get older? He says that just like those small but swift yachts that go about on the lakes and rivers without taking any help. If you notice the use of line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the ninth line of this stanza, that ask no aid or of sail or. Notice or, which means like take this thing or that thing, and or is a tool we use when we ride a boat. So this is what we call pun, pun, pun. Um, the poet is trying to say that he used uh, to ride a boat or to sail across the sea without any need for help because he was young, you know. In the same way, nothing used to affect him, nor did he have any worries concerning his surroundings. You know, because when you are young, you will be full of health and vitality, with never even a thought about getting unwell. Whereas in old age, everything, our mental and physical health both, is a downhill task. Everything is difficult. Everything is difficult because, because we are weak. And notice the beautiful thing that Coleridge used here when he spoke of his body like a house. Not cared this body for wind or weather when youth and I lived in it together. He likens his body to a house, and this house was inhabited by youth. Imagine that he likens his body to a house. Who were the inhabitants of the house? The speaker himself, or the poet, and his youth. So the idea that he became old is powerfully illustrated by saying that youth used to live with him in the same house, that is his body, and suddenly his youth left him. So it's like someone who used to share his house with someone else, and suddenly his roommate or the person who used to live with him left him alone. This itself shows feelings of loneliness and feelings of being abandoned. Yes. So Coleridge is very powerful in using images. So again, we notice in the second stanza as well as in the first stanza, the use of figures of speech plus powerful images together to to end up having what we call figurative images. So the poet here also uses these two words powerfully, now and then. The old person lives in the present but is nostalgic to the past. You know, when we are old, we always remember the past. It's not like when we are young, we speak about the present and that's it. But old people live in the present and yearn to the past when they were young. So the person becomes like having a sort of split when the person is still living in the past. You see? Okay. So if we go to the okay, now let us continue with the following stanza, which starts with flowers are lovely, love is flower like, friendship is a sheltering tree, all the joys that came down shower like of friendship, love, and liberty ere I was old. Now, this stanza is very important and it has beautiful images. In these lines, the poet says that when you are in your prime, everything looks lovely and you enjoy nature. As a sensitive young man, he felt the charm of the natural objects and looked forward with the vitality of youth. In his youth, he was physically stronger and had an attraction towards nature and its objects. What the poet is actually saying is that love is like a flower and friendship is like a tree which protects you from all kinds of weather. The poet feels himself to be lucky, to be blessed with friendship, and he's lucky that he has good friends. But as he reconciles with his reality that he has grown old, he consoles himself with this kind of philosophy that we only grow old when our way of thinking grows old. It's only the way you look at youth and age. We notice the use of simile in the first line of the stanza. So love is a flower like, and here likening love to a flower, and friendship is likened to a sheltering tree. Then we notice the use of all the joys, and here this is an apostrophe. This is an apostrophe. You know, apostrophe is the direct address of a thing or a person, whether present or absent, to achieve a certain purpose. So we notice here that the purpose of using this apostrophe is to express nostalgia. and nostalgia to the past. He remembers his youth with strong feelings. Youth enabled him to enjoy friendship, love, and liberty. So, are these things lost once and for all? Actually, no. The poet goes on and he further consoles himself by saying that youth has not gone by, but it's how we perceive this world. He refuses to accept the harsh reality of life, that is old age. I hope that you can see with me that his reluctance, when the poet says, "It cannot be that thou art gone," we see that Coleridge simply refuses that he has grown old, because in his old age he will become dependent and lose every joy and liberty. So he doesn't like the idea of growing old, because when you become old, instead of being independent and a free decision maker, you become dependent on others and you lose every joy and liberty. So, all in all, if we want to talk about the poem in general after having discussed the individual stanzas, we can see that youth and age, as the title suggests, of course, explores the passing of time and the onset of old age. And the poet tries to answer this question: what does it mean to grow old? In this great romantic poem about aging, the great poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge really and efficiently grapples with this very question. He tries to answer it and he tries to think aloud. Don't forget that Coleridge is a romantic poet, and romantic poets often glamorize and romanticize youth. You can read a lot of romantic poems and you will discover uh, how the romantics in general focus on the liberty and sincerity of childhood and adolescence, or the innocence of the child, as we saw in our poem The Lamb by William Blake. And I want to remind you that the father of the Romantic period, William Wordsworth, that I mentioned many times in our course, um, he, he he actually asked this question: what happened when the Romantics grew old? Each one of the Romantic poets did a different thing, actually. Whether we speak of Keats, Byron, Shelley, for example, Wordsworth, if you remember, abandoned many of his earlier political views. Coleridge, too, uh, did this by writing this great romantic poem about growing old. And in this poem, Coleridge muses upon his loss of youth, as old age begins to creep into his very bones, making his body weaker, and he realizes that he lacks the vitality he enjoyed during uh, his younger years. But there is an optimistic note that I want to draw your attention to. Coleridge feels that you are only as old as you feel. So this is the rough paraphrase of the main sentiment driving this poem. If we can, let me put it this way: if we can but remain young in mind, then we are young, no matter that our bodies may be growing older. So it is like Coleridge asserts, youth and I are housemates still. If we imagine that we still live in the same house with youth, and that youth did not abandon the nest, then we can still remain young. So this poem was described as one of the most perfect poems in terms of style, feeling, and everything, as well as being admired by Coleridge's contemporaries. And Coleridge himself considered this poem as his favorite. It is nice to know that Coleridge started working on youth and age as a poem when he was in his early 50s. You know, this stage of old age when the person starts to feel worried about what is to come. Um it is good to know that it is often said that Coleridge aged prematurely and looked weak and completely uh, lost his black hair, and he started to have white hair when he was still middle aged. So, so the poem really concerns itself um, with youth and age, but doesn't talk about mortality like many other poems. And the central metaphor that was often studied by critics is the house, this breathing house not built with hands, implying that a human body is somehow inferior to a man made house. Do you know why? Because our bodies decay so quickly, even faster than the houses. But the difference is you can always restore a house. But the question is, can you restore yourself when you become old? So finally, the mind can control the weakening body. And if we want to be optimistic, life is but thought. Okay, this is our poem for today by Coleridge. And I believe that this poem is different from Shakespeare's poem. You can feel that the material of the poem is basically thoughts and feelings that Coleridge himself tried to sum up in the poem. He tried to express his feelings about getting older, and his focus was inward. Uh, and above all, we noticed that the poem is full of first person pronouns. Uh, well, last time I asked you about Shakespeare, and today I will give you the answer. Shakespeare's poem was completely objective. The focus was outward. The poet was like a detached observer. He did not use any of the first person pronouns. You cannot know anything about Shakespeare if you read the poem. The focus was objective facts rather than subjective facts. Okay, so please, next time I want you to analyze Coleridge's poem as being subjective or objective. Okay, so here we come to the end of our lecture for today. Thank you very much. See you next time, inshallah, with another topic, which is going to be the meaning of epic. Thank you very much. See you next time.